This podcast features criminologists discussing sensitive themes and topics. Listener discretion is advised. Referred to as the real-life Olivia Benson, this female mindhunter went from psychiatric nurse to prolific FBI profiler. This is the Ann Burgess story. Hi, Amy.
Hello, Megan. How's it going today?
It's going good. I'm excited because this is one of my favorite types of cases to cover. She's if you haven't guessed from the title, a female trailblazer. And I get totally inspired and motivated by some of these women that we cover. I don't know about you, but this really gets my juices going.
Plus, it's a good break from some of the types of cases we normally cover.
Well, it's not exactly a break when you hear the kind of work she does. Yes. Okay. So the cases we're going to cover today, unfortunately, they still are those that are, involve the darkest parts of humanity. But this female covering these cases and how she got into this and her life story is really cool. I consider her a real life badass. I'm sure you'll agree. I'm sure our audience will agree.
Where did you come up with the idea for today's case?
Well, this might not surprise you to learn that my friend Michelle suggested a documentary. This often happens because she knows what I like to watch. And this documentary or docuseries, it was like a limited 3-part series, was recently out on Hulu called Mastermind. Have you heard of this one?
Nope.
No, of course not. When are you going to start watching some of these documentaries with me? Actually, you know what? If you watch them, then I might not be able to cover all these cases. But I will say this. I watched it. It was fantastic. And I saw, interestingly, that it was produced by sisters Elle and Dakota Fanning, which was kind of fun as well.
Oh, that is interesting. Okay.
I know. So following the documentary, I got to work on this trailblazer female in our field. So excitedly, and without further ado, let me introduce you to the subject of today's episode. Ann Burgess was born in Newton, which is a suburb of Boston, in 1936. She grew up seeing her uncles work as doctors, and so when the choice to pursue a career in the 1950s arrived, Ann said that women had 3 choices, basically, for careers. You could either be a teacher, a secretary, or a nurse. So for her, nursing was the obvious choice, having been around medical professionals and doctors. Ann went to Boston University to pursue her degree, and during her time there, she performed her clinical work at the Massachusetts Mental Health Center. So according to Ann, she chose psychiatric work because she was fascinated with human behavior. I feel like you and I can relate to that sentiment, Amy.
Yeah, I mean, I worked in the mental health field before I got fully involved in the criminal justice field.
Sure.
Yeah, I feel like most people who go into the social sciences are kind of in that area of just being fascinated with the way people are.
Yes, but Ann went into nursing, and she said as a nurse, you'll see this in documentaries, told her, just focus on like the medicine, on treatment. And she said, I wanted to hear about how people actually felt, their feelings, their behaviors, their reactions. So it was in this capacity that Ann began to work to treat victims of sexual assault. Now, in doing so, Ann really listened to their stories, and she began to study their behaviors. Ann would go on to obtain a master's degree and eventually her doctorate in nursing science. So Ann is both, just so you know, a certified board clinician and a researcher as well. So someone who can practice and someone who can research.
Oh, that's cool.
Now, as part of her research, she extended her original interest in sexual assault survivors. And after completing her PhD in 1969, Ann was introduced to Dr. Linda Holstrom. You might have heard of her. She was a sociologist at Boston University, a pretty prolific one. And the pair began working together, doing some extraordinary work, really modernizing the way people understood sexual assault. Because remember, there was very much a blame the victim mentality when sexual assault was even acknowledged. At the time, it wasn't often acknowledged either. So the pair founded a counseling program at Boston City Hospital where they interviewed rape victims and used their findings to publish a seminal study on the experiences of victims. In total, what they did was they interviewed 146 victims. These victims ranged from 3 years old to 73 years old.
Wow.
Yeah, the two then published their findings in an article, the 1973 article called The Rape Victim in the Emergency Ward.
And this was the first of its kind. No one was studying this.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was pretty much the first of its kind. It was so significant because, again, rape was viewed in a very different context. And in this study, Burgess and Holstrom attributed sexual assault to power and control, which is what we know right now, the main motivators and causes behind sexual assaults. And they were kind of the first to find this and put it down in writing.
Oh.
Additionally, this very significant work presented what's known as rape trauma syndrome. And this is a framework for understanding how victims react to assault. So the feelings of anxiety that victims have, self-blame at times, even physical reactions such as muscle tensions. This was also findings that emerged from their work. So really significant findings. Essentially, this work would impact the way law enforcement and other providers would treat victims and really how society as a whole could understand what it was truly like to be victimized. In fact, Amy, the work was so impactful that someone very unexpected would call Ann looking for help. The year was 1978. When Ann was contacted by William Webster, who was the director of the FBI at the time. She describes the phone call she received. She was working at the university telling her assistant to take a message. And her assistant came in and kind of said, I think you might want to take this call.
Can you imagine being a researcher and getting a call from the head of the FBI?
No.
Oh, so
It
exciting.
would be like a dream come true, right?
Yes.
If anyone's listening and they want to call us, So Ann was invited to come speak to the FBI because they had a serial rapist and they needed her help. They were really looking to better understand offenders and not victims per se, but as we probably both know, if Ann could convey what the victims were experiencing, the agents might better understand the types of offenders they were looking for.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
So
finally, the acknowledgement that victimization is useful for many reasons.
absolutely. These agents didn't have training in this area, and Ann really wanted to educate them in this regard. So, Amy, this encompasses both victim and offender profiling. And before I go on to discuss Ann's work, I just want to briefly discuss the types of profiling law enforcement can employ to investigate crimes and apprehend offenders. So profiling, when we're talking about that, or analyzing data to identify offenders, has become a much more frequently used tool in criminal investigations. It's developing as a science, but profiling is definitely not, I would say, acceptable science. It's kind of debated in terms of empirical reviews. So with some mixed reviews as to, how helpful profiling can be and how precise. But, and certainly we know that it can't be used as a sole method for solving crimes, but extremely useful tool. So let me just briefly talk about a couple of the major types of profiling, which you probably already know. And first would be offender profiling. And this can be, like trying to profile an offender by looking at case facts, behaviors, a crime scene, the mode of murder. Or this can be profiling types of offenders who commit certain crimes based on information from law enforcement. So there's a couple different ways you can do this. I won't geek out too much to this, even though I know some of our listeners like to geek out, but there's an actuarial approach, which is you can look at certain background factors to try to point to who an offender is. But then there's also more of a clinical approach. So where actuarial relies on data, the clinical approach relies on human behavior per se.
And using both is really the gold standard, right? Being able to compare someone's behavior to what we know about others, but also being able to talk to that particular individual.
Absolutely. Definitely gold standard. So offender profiling is one thing. You have victim profiling, which is what we are going to talk about here, and that's identifying characteristics of crime victims to help solve those crimes. Usually identifying the crimes, doing the victimology, can lead to profiling an offender. So they kind of go hand in hand. You kind of need the victimology or the victim profiling to really identify an offender.
And as I often tell my students, victimology is not blaming the victim.
No.
But at first glance, it might appear that way. But it's just trying to understand who the victim was so we can get better information on what happened.
Absolutely. Thank you for clarifying that. So you have offender and victim profiling, which is, most people know that. You can use DNA profiling, and that's simply using DNA to find offenders. You can do crime scene profiling, which is very interesting and very important because what you can learn about an offender from a crime scene specifically, is it disorganized? Have they arranged something? Did they use something at the scene? Is there staging? So there's so many things you can learn from a crime scene.
Mm-hmm.
There's also geographical profiling. So I'm sure you've heard of spatial mapping, and that's basically just using geography to profile offenders.
Yep.
I'll give you a classic example here. If someone's frequenting rest stops for murder, we might surmise that they are likely a trucker or someone who's traveling.
Mm-hmm.
And so these geographic profiles include elements of distance, mobility, locality, and I think these are extremely interesting as well. They're also used by law enforcement in murder investigations when they're looking where bodies are dumped. So they call them body dump sites, which is not the most sensitive way to say this, but unfortunately, they can help to provide information about an offender, though. Where bodies are placed, if they're near a highway, if they're remote, how they're disposed of.
They need to come up with something. I don't like that either, though. It's so dehumanizing.
It is. Yeah, sorry. We can just say where remains are found for our purposes.
Well,
here.
no, it's not your fault. You didn't make up the terminology.
Anyway, there are other types of profiling, but I just wanted to give you some of the major ones that are used. Profiling can be great because it can be super helpful to an investigation. However, profiles can also hinder an investigation when a profile is incorrect and it's like kind of stuck with. This famously happened with the Unabomber case. The Unabomber, the offender was profiled incorrectly for quite some time, which really hindered the apprehension of Ted Kaczynski. They profiled him as someone with, I think, lower education, someone who was a mechanic. So, in the end, Ted Kaczynski, he published a manifesto, and it turned out he was very, very well educated, and he just didn't fit with the profile.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so profiling is not an exact science, but it's an extremely helpful tool, and we're going to see how this plays out. Back to Ann. Now, the FBI had newly formed the famed BSU, or Behavioral Science Unit, in response to the increase in sex crimes and homicides countrywide, and that was in the 70s. The BSU was led by famed agents John Douglas and Robert Ressler. They were first to coin the serial killer terminology, and they were first to study serial killers that we now know of, like John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, and many others, who we'll discuss in this episode, and who they used to designate offenders. And these were the guys that wanted Ann's help. But would Ann want to work on cases involving the very worst offenders in the nation? She had a decision to make, and it wasn't an easy one, she said. With 4 small children at the time and no real interest in offenders, she was interested in victims, but not criminal offenders. Ann recalls that she had to consider her children, and she was already working full-time at the university as the dean of nursing.
Oh, wow.
So she's got a full plate. She's very accomplished. Her husband worked in academia as well, and he was also always very supportive. But again, she just wasn't interested in offenders. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, though, Ann decided it would be worth it to help the victims. And so she began her work with the BSU and with John Douglas. But Ann insisted that the work would have to be research-driven, and the research they gathered would have to be organized, they would have to collect it methodically, and they would have to publish it. Those were her requirements. Mm-hmm. And she said that was the problem. So they were doing these interviews. They had started to interview these very significant offenders.
They were doing more like case studies?
Yes. And they didn't have like a questionnaire, right? Mm-hmm. They're just asking them questions. They had the ideas, but they couldn't organize it and pull out.
So it wasn't, there was no methodology, it sounds
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that was the problem. And that's what Ann helped them develop. She helped them develop theme-driven questionnaires. Mm-hmm. She also lobbied and received a huge grant from the Department of Justice to meet with and interview these offenders. In total, working with John Douglas on this research, they met with and interviewed 36 offenders to learn more about offender and victim profiles. And it was from this work, by the way, that the original classifications of serial killers came. So I don't know if you've heard this before, but the organized versus disorganized killer. Mm-hmm. This was very much an original classification. They were also the first to establish, and this is really important, the connection between an offender's traumatic childhood experience and their later offending. See, we kind of just accept that in this field. We understand that, but they were the first to find it through these interviews and learning about the traumatic childhoods of these killers.
Yeah, I think sometimes we forget that just because something seems logical, that doesn't make it scientific, right? Like you
Exactly.
said, we take it for granted,
Exactly.
but yes, it's based in science.
Exactly. Very good point. And in working at the BSU, Ann was also able to consult on some very prolific cases. So Ann was brought in originally to help work on a serial rape case. Dubbed the ski mask rapist, because of course there's a moniker, this assailant sexually assaulted approximately 80 women from the 1970s to 1980s, beginning in Louisiana, and a lot of his attacks were focused there, but his assaults spanned approximately 12 states in total. Now, the FBI was tasked with finding and stopping this serial predator, so the BSU went to work on a profile. The crimes had started as robberies and escalated to sexual assault, which told the BSU actually that they should be very concerned because they might escalate again. And what's after sexual assault? Likely
Murder.
Right. Another alarming sign was that the assailants had also gone from targeting females who were alone to targeting females whose partners were home. In these assaults, the offender was making the partners watch helplessly as he assaulted the females.
That's a very particular profile.
Very particular and also a sign of escalation. But the authorities were stumped for some time as this offender was also pretty skilled at evading arrest and identification. And as we know, the 70s and 80s were not the time of surveillance and DNA. So the FBI asked Ann to interview the victims to try and find out common themes. Nervously, Ann agreed to step in and help. Amazingly, when Ann arrived in Louisiana to interview the victims, the authorities there thought she was an FBI impersonator since she was a woman.
Jeez.
They actually called to verify her identity. Once the initial resistance passed, Ann was able to elicit rich information from all those who had been assaulted, and she was able to help compile a profile. Now, part of this profile entailed the offender's focus on wealthy victims. And through a pattern of his behavior, things that he said, the way that he behaved, these factors led Ann to surmise that he would probably be a confident alpha male, highly adaptable. So she surmised that he would have a military background and likely be driving a flashy car. Now, the flashy car bit was particularly helpful as this information was disseminated to law enforcement agencies and would ultimately lead to the offender's capture. When an officer noticed a very flashy red Pontiac Trans Am in the area one night during a reported assault. He noticed it and decided to take note of it because of this information.
Oh, interesting. So was there like a bolo for flashy cars, or they just had this like in the back of their mind?
They just had the information. It wasn't a bolo, but like the profile had been disseminated through law enforcement. So they were, be on the lookout, yeah, but it wasn't really official. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
But when the police located the owner of the vehicle and brought him in for questioning, shockingly, he pretty quickly confessed to over 80 robberies and sexual assaults. Crazy.
Wow. 80?
Yes. John Simonis was his name, and he was a serial predator who got life in prison following his confessions.
So I'm assuming Ann gets credited for the events that led to his arrest.
I have to tell you, Ann is credited now, and she was credited to some degree, but she was a consultant, and she was a female. And I think that John Douglas and Ressler, they were the guys that were getting the real credit.
Yep.
However, Ann was doing the work. And John Simonis, his real life really mirrored the profile that Ann and the BSU had compiled. So this was a huge win for the unit. But was it a fluke, or could they do it again? 2 years later, Ann would collaborate with Ressler on the case of 2 murdered boys in Nebraska. In 1983, 13-year-old Danny Joe Eberly went missing and was found murdered shortly after. Not 3 months later, 12-year-old Christopher Walden also went missing and was found murdered. Both boys had been stabbed multiple times, bound with rope, stripped to their underwear, and mutilated before their death. Now, the crimes both involved sexual aspects but did not involve sexual penetration, which would help inform the profile, and that's why I bring it up. The original profiler was done by Robert Ressler, who was, again, head of the BSU, and it led to the arrest of a suspect, but it turned out that suspect had no involvement in the crime. But the revised profile was done by Ressler with Ann's help, and this time the profile would be different. The profilers theorized that the offender's mutilation and the sexually motivated crime without penetration likely reflected his own self-hatred of his sexual orientation. And while some eyewitnesses had reportedly gotten a partial vehicle description, Ressler and Burgess theorized that the offender would likely be found at schools or in a church or a scout position. So what they were saying was it would be someone the boys knew and trusted, and they would have met through a school or Boy Scouts or church. And what do you know, when they released this information to the public and a woman decided to write down a suspicious plate of a vehicle cruising outside of her preschool, the driver saw her doing this and circled back, threatening the woman, who was able to run and lock herself inside the school to avoid harm. He actually physically went after her.
So scary.
Yeah. This woman called the police, who promptly responded, and a search of the man's car would reveal rope that matched the crime scenes.
Wow.
Ann also theorized that the offender would have detective magazines in his possession. And a search of this offender's home, or the suspect's home at the time, revealed that she was correct. 21-year-old scout leader John Jobert was arrested and convicted of the murders, later to be executed for his crimes in Nebraska. The BSU received accolades for their work. It was a profile and offender match. And what this meant, Amy, was that they had proven this was no fluke. And soon enough, Ann was working on another pressing child abduction case. Now, in this case, it's a little bit different. Ann was tasked with interviewing a young child victim, and the stakes were very high. So what happened here is that two 7-year-old girls were kidnapped in an Illinois suburb in 1985. Their names were Missy Ackerman and her young friend, Opal Horton. While Missy was taken, Opal managed to escape a vehicle by jumping out of the car window. So this kid was incredibly brave and lucky. Opal had survived, and they needed to get information from her.
Because the other girl was missing at this point. So that's why it was pressing. Yeah.
That's correct. That's why it was so pressing. And Ann said that it seemed like law enforcement, they were very focused on finding the missing girl, absolutely, but through traditional routes, right? Getting plate numbers, witnesses, things of that nature. But Ann felt like they were ignoring the information they could get from this survivor, from the little girl. And unfortunately, she had suffered a very serious trauma. So Ann focused on this crucial interview with Opal. As Ann describes, one of her techniques was always to have those she interviewed draw what happened as a way to focus on the task and reduce the stress. She said it was very successful in high-stress situations. Now, in this particular case, Opal drew what happened and provided a composite sketch of her assailant and his car.
Wait, I'm sorry. She provided the sketch, or she told someone?
She provided, sorry, yes.
I was like, what?
Well, she drew, so in her drawing and in her telling, she was able to provide the information for a composite sketch.
Okay, I was going to say, that's one incredible little girl.
Well, it was still incredible because what she drew and the information she gave actually led to the capture of the offender, who was named Brian Dugan.
Did they find the little girl alive?
Unfortunately, he had murdered Missy already, and her body was found shortly after, which is terribly tragic. But I will say that with Ann working with Opal, probably prevented many more murders from Mr. Dugan. He was a serial rapist and murderer who was sentenced to death. He would later have his sentence to commuted to life, and he would never get out of prison. Now, Ann had worked on many cases where her analysis led to the arrest, apprehension, and conviction of many offenders. But after all of these years in service at the BSU, she began in the 70s, and this was getting to the late 80s. She said that many of her esteemed colleagues were retiring and they were doing other projects. John Douglas and Ressler were writing books, they were consulting. And so Ann decided it was also time to move on. But her next endeavor would be quite the controversial one and certainly would not make her former colleagues happy. So perhaps no case Ann worked on is as well known as the Menendez brothers.
Oh, I didn't know she worked on that case.
Exactly. I didn't either. While we might know the case well, I'll just briefly explain that Lyle and Eric Menendez have been incarcerated now for over 30 years for the 1989 murder of their parents, Jose and Kitty Menendez. I think there is a new series coming out on this. I could swear Chloe Sevigny is playing Kitty Menendez.
Oh.
Unless I dreamt that, but I think that's right. One of the most celebrated court television trials, the entire nation watched as Lyle and Eric's defense attempted to show that the boys were abused by Jose, not just physically, but sexually, and that Kitty was aware and had not protected her children. Now, Ann had testified as an expert witness for prosecutors in many cases, but this time she was contacted by the defense and reluctantly agreed to interview one of the defendants in this case.
I should know this because it was such a famous case, but were they trying to claim self-defense, or they were just using that as a mitigating factor so that they'd be maybe like spared the death penalty?
No, they were going for innocence. Yeah, they were trying to use self-defense.
Self-defense, okay.
Yes. What was Ann's role in this case? Well, she spent 50 hours, or approximately 50 hours, interviewing Eric Menendez. As I mentioned, her former colleagues were not happy. They cautioned Ann that it would likely be a bad move to work for the defense of two spoiled rich kid murderers. But Ann did not agree with them. What she actually concluded was that she found that Eric was in fact abused by Jose for years. And while she didn't condone the murder, and she says that very openly, she felt that it was really important to speak to the motives here. She also thought it was important to give male victims a voice because Ann's work had always been about moving the ball and the field forward to acknowledge victims in all different shapes and sizes, if you will. What happened in this trial? Well, the trial resulted in a hung jury, so they just couldn't decide. But in a second trial, the Menendez brothers were found guilty of the murder. Now, Ann did not testify in the second trial as the judge prohibited any evidence of abuse from being presented.
Why?
I'm not sure why the judge prohibited the evidence at the time. Maybe the judge didn't feel there was a compelling case.
I was going to say, there's no way they couldn't have been going for self-defense if that part wasn't allowed in.
I don't remember the specifics of the second trial at all, I should tell you. But I know that, there was no evidence of sexual abuse that was allowed. So it also, I would not want to say there was no evidence of abuse, but it might have been that some of the evidence of physical abuse was allowed, just not the sexual abuse claims. But I can't say for certain. I can say for certain, absolutely, though, that the strategy did not work. The brothers were convicted and they were given a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Now, Ann was vocal about saying that she felt that the sentence was overly punitive as the two were not serial killers. As of today, we know that the pair are still incarcerated, but also I would like to point out that they do have some support now from others who had made claims against Jose. Not full support, but there's definitely some more information. Ann does not regret her role in the case, believing it was just as important to give male victims the same voice that females had. Ann would assume another role in a very prominent sexual assault trial, one that you know as well. Specifically, she helped Bill Cosby victim Andrea Constand to recall key details in her assault that would help convict serial rapist Bill Cosby first in a civil trial and then in a criminal trial. Constand credits Burgess with playing a huge role in her recovery and success against Cosby, which has been instrumental in the Me Too movement of the last several years. So, in many ways, you might argue that Ann's work was one of the driving forces behind Me Too, and she finally got to see some of the fruits of her labor all these years later. She certainly has many successes to her credit. So I just mentioned those were the big cases that she worked on, but there were many more in all of her years of work. Her work was significant with profiling. Her work was significant with helping victims. And she has a lot of legacy. So let me discuss what we have so far. First of all, Ann Burgess pioneered the field of forensic nursing. So what is this? Well, forensic nurses treat victims of crimes and traumatic events, which the majority include domestic violence cases, sexual assault, and other forms of abuse. And so they document these injuries, they collect the evidence, and then they usually testify in a court of law. That's forensic nursing. Ann still carries a full teaching course load at Boston College, where she's conducting various research projects, including one on missing and murdered Indigenous women.
Why don't we get her on the show? Did you try reaching out to her?
I really should have. I didn't, but I would like to say probably the reason why is because as I was writing, I was also with the baby and I had my hands full.
Yeah.
But I will tell you, as soon as I finished writing it, I went, oh my gosh, she's actually been on other podcasts.
Yeah.
So I probably should have gotten her on the show, but that doesn't mean we can't get her on the show.
Yes.
Okay. But it's a good point. Ann published books with Douglas and Ressler about crime classifications, patterns, and motives in sexual homicides. So this is so instrumental in identifying the offenders of these crimes. Recently, she published another book, Killer by Design, Murderers, Mindhunters, and My Quest to Decipher the Criminal Mind. So when you talk about a book for book club, Amy,
that's a good one.
I think I have my next one. And so I keep saying Mindhunter because you don't watch documentaries, you just haven't caught on to it yet, but I'm sure other audience members have. So you might not recognize it, but there was a show, Mindhunters, on Netflix.
Yes. I'm very well aware of that. That was a big one.
Okay, good.
That's old though, right? That one's...
It's a couple years old now, but it was about the original establishment of the FBI's BSU unit and how they caught some very prolific offenders. Just so you know, Holt McClaney is in it. He's one of my favorite actors. I used to definitely have a crush on him, and his character was inspired by Robert Ressler. Well, the famous character in that show, Wendy Carr, was inspired by Ann. Now, on the show, I'll just tell you, Wendy is a psychologist, but her character was called upon to consult with the FBI on serial cases, and it was her idea, her insistence, that they interview, document, and publish the findings. So this is Ann's character. When asked, why do you think they made her a psychologist and not a nurse? She said it was probably just easier for people to understand and relate to. On top of inspiring Wendy Carr, first of all, if you haven't watched Mindhunter, other people should definitely watch it. I can't wait till the next season. But I definitely encourage you to watch the Hulu documentary, Mastermind, to Think Like a Killer. It was awesome. It was a 3-parter, and you get this information and more. And you know what's great? Ann is just up front and center in it. She is still a force, no doubt about it. I love in this documentary also that they feature her husband and their life a little bit, so you kind of see the personal side of her. I highly recommend it to the audience. But I also want to discuss, before we go today, I'm not ending there, I want to briefly discuss how Ann's work really fits in with females who work in the fields. And, kind of a look back then versus now. I don't know if you remember the episode that I covered, Jana Monroe. She was also an FBI profiler. Yes, of course.
Is that the Silence of the Lambs one?
Yes, of course. Okay, so I was breaking down in that episode kind of the percentages of women who work in different parts of the criminal justice system. So I'm not going to rehash all of that, but I do want to just briefly discuss kind of how women came to work in the field. So I just want to remind the audience that probably the most important thing that happened for females was the Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972. This was the act that opened the door for women in law enforcement. So since that time, women have become part of the policing profession, but certainly in smaller numbers than men. And we know that policing is the area that females are the least involved in the criminal justice system. It's about 13% of officers that are female. The thing is, what we've also learned is that women are great in many areas of policing, and they have skills that are definitely a good counterbalance to males. So females are better with interpersonal communication. They're very good at diffusing certain situations instead of escalating them. Females are often cited as being great in community policing situations. Females have a number of benefits working in law enforcement, but still face a number of barriers and still face discrimination in the field. When we turn to the FBI, though, so that's kind of just, traditional policing. When we turn to the FBI, the number is higher for females involved. And I was pleased to learn this. In fact, about a quarter of all agents are females, and 60% are intelligence analysts.
Oh, I'm assuming that's probably a recent number. I wonder what it would be like compared to 20 years ago.
I mean, yes, that's a recent number, but let me talk about the first. And so I'll say in 1972, Joanne Pierce Misko and Susan Rowley Malone became the first female FBI agents. breaking down the wall for the rest. So right when that Equal Opportunity or Employment Act was passed, these two women got in. However, and this I learned, actually under J. Edgar Hoover in the 1920s, Alaska Davidson, Jessie Duckstein, and Lenore Houston were made the first special agents. But J. Edgar Hoover wouldn't tolerate female agents.
Oh.
And so he, what I read, made life pretty hard for them and demanded resignations from the women, forcing them out and then leaving the FBI without female agents for almost 50 years.
Wow.
That's right. And that was until 1972. By the end of that year, just so you know, you wanted the numbers, and this is where I'm going to leave us. By the end of 1972, 11 women would be sworn in as agents. And as of current time, that number is 3,000.
Amazing.
So
we have a lot of
kudos
students. Yeah, we have a lot of students who want to be, who are interested in intelligence. And it's definitely an area of growth for sure.
I think so as well. We also had one student who went directly from her undergraduate degree into a position at the FBI. And students are often asking me, what do you have to do to work for the FBI?
Good.
And I tell them,
don't do drugs. No.
you have to be beyond good. I mean, I prep some of the students for the internship. So we have an internship with the FBI that opens. The internship opening only happens once a year for 1 week. You can only apply during that time, and you have to hit it hard. And it has to be, you have to be a superstar.
Yep.
So I'd like to dedicate this episode to Ann and all of our female superstars who work for the FBI and in many of the other wonderful branches of our system. Thank you for the work you do. Hopefully we can get Ann on the show at some point.
Yes, let's do it. Meghan, this was so interesting. Thank you. I didn't realize how much she was involved in.
I know. It was really fun. I really enjoyed this episode today. All right. We'd like to thank everyone for joining us. Hope you enjoyed learning about Ann Burgess's work, and we'll catch you next time on Women in Crime. Women in Crime is written and hosted by Meghan Sachs and Amy Shlosberg. Our producer is James Varga. Script editing is by Abagail Belcastro. Audio editing is by Siler Burr and Jose Alfonso. And music is by Desert Media. If you enjoy the show, please remember to follow and leave a review. You can also support the show through Patreon, where you can get access to additional ad-free content such as exclusive full-length episodes, lectures, a book club, and virtual happy hours with Meghan and Amy. For more information, visit patreon.com/womenandcrime. Sources for today's episode include the Hulu documentary Mastermind, JerryWilliams.com, History of Women FBI Agents, Boston College Magazine, Biography.com, CrimeLibrary.org, A&E, and an article from Glamour.